Hello everybody, today I'm going to share my thoughts on the Canon R5 for landscape photography specifically. Today, I wanted to kind of give my thoughts and opinions about the Canon R5, but from a little bit of a different perspective. There are so many Canon R5 videos on YouTube, but I wanted to come at it from the way that I've used this camera, and that's for landscape photography. So I got this camera very shortly after it came out, so I've been using it for over 6 months, and I've taken like many shots with it. Lots of landscape photography shots, a few other little projects, but nothing super major. So landscape's been what this camera's done 90% of the time. So I kind of wanted to go over some pros and cons of this really great Canon mirrorless camera for landscape photography. There are pros and there are cons. First off, one of the first pros is that it has a really well-designed, super rugged body. So I haven't been super hard on this camera at all, but I can tell you that it seems very tough, easily as tough as a 5D Mark IV or any of those. And I know the weather sealing inside is rated to the same as any of the 5D series, possibly the 1D series, but it's definitely super well weather sealed. It has the shutter closes like that. So when you are changing lenses, you aren't dealing with dust and stuff getting on the sensor, which is a huge deal because with Sony, except for I think the new A1 and the A9 series, their shutter closes too, but the A7R series stays open, the Nikon Z series, it stays open, so stuff gets on the sensor. So that's like one aspect that's really good in the body design. But also it's very ergonomic, and it just feels tough. It just has a great tough feel, and I think that's something that the landscape photographers are going to really value because they have their cameras outside most of the time. So the next major pro is that the in-body image stabilization on this camera is the best I've ever used, seen, or heard about. It's absolutely insane for a full-frame camera. The Panasonic G9 had really good IBIS, but this honestly rivals that. I use it with the 100 to 500, and I was shooting shots at 500 millimeters, way close under 1/100th of a second. So really slow shutter speeds, which is insane at 500 millimeters. And you can hold you can handheld with an ultra wide lens like the 15 to 35. You can handhold, excuse me, for around a second. Some people claim to have done more. I've only done right around a second, and that just means that you're really versatile in the field for getting handheld landscape shots. So whether that's if you like me and you're hiking and climbing, you don't necessarily want to bring a tripod, that makes it a big deal for that. Or if you just in general, you can have a lower shutter speed and expect higher image quality at a lower ISO. So that to me is a really invaluable aspect of this camera for landscape photographers. So the next pro is going to be that this is a great option for hybrid shooters, and by that I mean either you do a lot of video too, or you do landscape and wildlife, and those are the two categories I kind of have in mind. So for video, obviously this thing is a beast. It has 8K, 4K 120, great 4K modes. Now there's the overheating thing, and I've shot a lot of video with this camera, and kind of shooting with it normally, I have not had an issue with overheating once I updated the firmware. And even before the firmware, I wasn't really stretching its video legs too much before then, but after the firmware, it's done great with not overheating. I mean, it can. I had one time it did, and that was shooting 4K HQ, and that was after 3 hours of kind of start and stop recording. So, you know, it has come up, but that's the only time. I haven't shot much 8K yet because, I mean, it's a little bit of a parlor trick in my opinion. It's just not something that's really usable in our workflow too often, but it does do it in the little bit that I've done. I mean, it looks fantastic. So that's kind of coming at it from a video perspective. From the wildlife perspective, the autofocus is really great. The tracking, the animal IAF, the people IAF too, if you're kind of shooting sports mixed in with your landscape. So again, you can kind of see that the strength of this camera is going to come when you start using it for lots of things. And that's going to be kind of a theme going forward, that's a true strength of this camera, that if you use it for a lot of things, it's going to do really well at all of those things. So the last pro I'm going to talk about real quick is the really, really great RF lenses that Canon has released. I haven't tried an RF lens that I haven't loved yet. From the 15 to 35, the 70-200, the 100 to 500. I even tried out, I don't own, but I tried out the 51-2 and the 28 to 70. They're crazy sharp lenses, cool lenses. They do different things. And as a landscape photographer, if you're interested in like sharp images from your lenses and high quality lenses, like the RF system is great. Now they're not the cheapest, and there's not the most variety, and there's no third party. So those are things to kind of keep in mind as far as lenses go. But the lenses that you do get and put on this camera, you can be confident you're going to get great images from. All right, so let's talk about those pesky cons. And again, the cons are all coming at it from this perspective of a landscape photographer. And the first one is image quality and dynamic range is great, but it's not as good as the A7R4 or the Nikon Z7, two other cameras that I've used. It's like, what, maybe 10 to 20% below. Like, it's not a lot below, but it is a little bit noticeable. I mean, if you push your shadows and highlights a lot, it does have an AA filter on there. Now, I don't notice sharpness being a big issue with this camera at all. Like, the way that it works in conjunction with the RF lenses, you don't really have to worry about sharpness. So that AA filter, it doesn't really come into play in my opinion. But the dynamic range, like, it's not quite at the level of the A7R4 and the Z7. But it's really close. This is the best sensor that Canon's ever put out. I shot Canon a long time ago, and let me tell you, the difference between it and Nikon then was huge, but the difference between this and the Nikon Z7 is really quite small. But if absolute image quality and dynamic range is your thing, you're probably gonna wanna look more in the Nikon Sony direction. The battery life is meh. I have 3 batteries, and you know, if I go and shoot in the mountains all day doing landscape photography, I'm going to be into the 3rd battery probably at the end of the day. It's not wonderful battery life. It's not bad. It's not like Sony 4 years ago bad or A7R2 bad. It's just meh. So, like, you know, you're gonna have to buy several batteries, and that's just gonna be a factor going into it. You can turn off some settings, and it does have a battery save mode, which is really nice. And it kind of turns off some features and stuff. So like if you're in a pinch and you're getting down on the second half of your last battery, you have some options. But it's, it's something to consider. The battery life's met. The last thing I'm going to talk about is that it's more expensive than the A7R4 and the Z7 and the Z7 too. So there's 2 Nikons which are very similar. If you're a pure landscape photographer, you should probably consider that you're going to be paying for features that you're maybe not going to use. Like, the things that make this camera cost what it costs are the 8K, the 4K 120 in video, and then the super high frame rate and and great autofocus in photos. Those aren't things that landscape photographers are necessarily going to use. Now, like I mentioned before, if you are a hybrid wildlife photographer, if you shoot a lot of video with your landscape, then yeah, I mean, immediately this becomes a non-issue. But if you are a pure landscape photographer or you use another camera for your video work, so you're gonna be paying for features that you're not necessarily using in this camera. All right, so for this last section, I'm going to kind of quantify my my opinion on this camera and kind of give it some ratings and some different categories on a 0 to 10 scale, so you can kind of get an idea of where it might fall versus some of maybe its competition, and kind of see where I think that its super strong points are and maybe where it's a little weaker. So design and ergonomics, I went with 9 out of 10. I have no issue with it. It's a great, well-designed camera. The controls are kind of classic Canon controls, which I love. I think they're super smart. Is it the best out there? I think it's debatable. Part of me actually likes some of the ergonomic things that Nikon did with their Z series. And then I also really enjoyed the Panasonic S1R. I would say they're easily about the same design and ergonomics wise. So, but you're not going to be disappointed with this camera on the way it feels in your hands and when you use it in the field. Image quality, 7 out of 10. Like I said, it's that notch, a slight notch below in dynamic range, the Nikon and the Sony. And I think it's really definitely you're gonna be able to print really well with it. Your photos are gonna look awesome, but it's just not quite up to that level. Autofocus, 9 out of 10. Like, maybe I should give it 10 out of 10. I don't know how you can give a camera 10 out of 10 for autofocus, but I had no issue with it. The eye tracking's great. The animal tracking is great. I didn't use it a whole lot, but I used it a little bit. It's great. It's super fast. It's super accurate. Never had an issue with accuracy in the field. Like, if it said it was in focus, it was in focus. And so I really value that in a camera. And it's always nice to, maybe autofocus isn't as important to you as a landscape photographer, but good autofocus is good autofocus, and this camera definitely has it. So the last little rating I'm going to give it is value, and then I'm going to break that down into kind of two parts, because it's a value for landscape and then value for general purpose everything camera. So for landscape, I'm only going to give it a 5 out of 10 because it's significantly more expensive than the A7R IV and the Nikon Z7 series. You can get a Z7 for almost half of this price, and you're going to get just as good at images out of it. So you need to kind of consider that. And then the A7R IV actually has more megapixels, 61 versus the 45 in here. So you should really consider that if you're just a pure landscape photographer, that this camera, like, it's not your best value, and you may not be utilizing all of its features to its fullest. But as far as for general purpose photography, like if you shoot landscapes as just part of what you do, if you shoot wildlife, weddings, portraits, sports, or anything like that, then it immediately goes up to 9 out of 10. Because, like, when you think about it, the A1, which just came out from Sony, is their do everything ultimate camera, and this camera is, probably 80 to 90% of that camera, maybe more. You could shoot any type of video you'd want to shoot with it. You can shoot wildlife, sports, and then you have landscape on top of that. So, like, if you're doing a lot of things, this camera, it definitely beats the Nikon and the Sony. They're only in this conversation if you are just a landscape photographer. So that's how I'm going to kind of break down this as a value option. So, all right, so that kind of wraps up my thoughts on the Canon R5 for landscape photography. If you enjoyed this video, I would love it if you would hit that like button. And then if you like our videos that we make about photography, landscape photography, and then outdoor adventures, then we would love it if you would hit that subscribe button. So we'll see you on the next adventure.